In a world where there are bad guys.
Claire, this isn't Thor.
Fine.
In a country.
America.
In America, where we are granted the freedom of press.
Under the First Amendment.
I was getting there.
Granted the freedom of press as expressed in the First Amendment of our Constitution. This right extends beyond professional journalism.
It applies to student press too.
But that right has been hindered.
Through prior restraint, censorship, and cease and desist.
Stop the presses?
Never. I like the echo.
Thanks, I thought it added a nice touch.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Claire Boston,
And I'm Makenzie Mauntler.
and we are here to talk to you about the First Amendment.
Particularly the freedom of press.
Even more particularly, the freedoms granted by student press.
Ooh.
So, Kens, why even talk about the First Amendment at all?
Because it's important.
Well, obviously.
And besides that, it is First Amendment week.
Wait, First Amendment week, what's that?
Well, Claire, let me tell you.
Oh, please do.
First Amendment Week is an annual event held here on the BVU campus that celebrates our First Amendment rights through various events, activities that are held by students in order to inform, educate, and involve the community.
Wait, hold up. So you said First Amendment rights. You mean there's more than one?
Of course, that we have 5 rights that are granted to us. There's the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of petition, and the freedom of press.
Which is what we're talking about today.
Right, Claire?
So, rumor has it that we actually have the leading expert in regards to student press laws and one of the leading experts in regards to the First Amendment joining us today.
Oh, that's no rumor, Claire. That's for realsies.
So live here in the studio, we have Frank LoMonte, who is the Executive Director of the Student Press Law Center, who is actually Skyping us in here all the way from the Student Press Law Center. Hello, Frank.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be in Iowa remotely.
Yeah, it's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today.
So you're the Executive Director of the Student Press Law Center. Can you kind of explain to our viewers what the SPLC does and what its mission is?
Sure, thanks again. So the SPLC has been around since 1974, and it was set up really as an outgrowth of a book by an investigative reporter, Jack Nelson, who wrote a book called Captive Voices about the state of student journalism at that time in the 1970s. And what Jack found was that a lot of students were being driven out of the newsroom because they were finding journalism to be frustrating and unrewarding because they were being so heavily censored by their schools. And so the Student Press Law Center was set up as a direct response to that study in that book to be kind of a counterweight, basically, so that students who felt like their rights were being infringed and violated felt like they had somebody on their side, somebody who could speak for them and provide them with the research and the knowledge and the training to go out and be their own best advocates. And so that's what we've been doing for the past 40 years. We sort of serve as a source of research, guidance, information, coaching to help students stand up for their own rights and hopefully improve the state of the law around the country.
Awesome.
Right. So how long have you been with the SPLC?
So I took over as the executive director in January of 2008, so 6 years now, and it's just an incredibly rewarding and exciting and energizing job, and every day feels like the first.
Awesome.
Right.
So we know that you have degrees in both journalism and law. Can you talk about how that kind of professional marriage came about for you?
Well, I was in journalism about as long as I can possibly remember, going back all the way to junior high school, and that was really all I ever wanted to be in life, was a writer. And I did have the good fortune to have a career in newspapers as a daily newspaper reporter and a columnist and an editor, and enjoyed that immensely. But was interested in the challenge of going back and getting further education. Got my law degree at the University of Georgia back in 2000, and practiced practiced law for quite a while at a big corporate law firm down in Atlanta, where I had a very enjoyable private practice, but was volunteering on the side for the SPLC as they needed me to go out and either do a case or do a guest speech or lecture for them. And I just got more and more interested and involved in the work. And so when this opportunity came up and they posted the job in 2007, I was just really pleased and honored even to be considered for it. The person that I took over for, Mark Goodman, who now is a media law professor at Kent State, is really kind of a legend in the field and had this job for 22 years. And so to be able to succeed him was really special. And he's still a very good friend of the SPLC and still a great advocate for freedom of the student press.
Well, that's awesome. So where did your interest in the First Amendment kind of start?
Well, I was fortunate enough in my own school career not to have to deal with a tremendous amount of censorship. I worked at a college newspaper down in Florida where we were actually separately incorporated. And so we were free from the influence of our institution. They really had no control over us because we raised our own money and we had that financial independence to be able to publish what we wanted. But what I did find and what we did run into time and time again in my experience was that we needed to turn to lawyers for help when we had problems getting access to meetings and to records. In fact, during my time at Florida, we actually were forced to bring suit against our own college twice in order to get into meetings that we felt like we had a legal right to cover, and we're successful both times. Actually set some really good legal precedent by going to the Florida Supreme Court on 2 occasions against the university, and both times we had the services of a really amazing volunteer lawyer, a guy by the name of Tom Julin in Miami, who's still down there practicing law. And Tom had been the editor of his own college newspaper and was doing those cases free of charge just as a labor of love. And so Tom, I tell him all the time, I'm in touch with him still now, really was my inspiration to get into this line of work because I saw just how powerful the law could be, how it could open doors and it could be kind of an empowerment and an equalizer for people who were trying to take on powerful government institutions.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there are some differences between high school and college press, though.
Right.
So what are kind of some major differences in regards to that? And, how does it affect, what high schoolers can and can't print because they are high schoolers? And then should they be granted like the same rights as professional journalisms?
Sure. Well, there's definitely both sort of tangible and intangible differences between the way the high school press typically is set up and governed and the way the college press is typically set up and governed. And some of that makes good sense. Some of that is logical. At the college level, the U.S. Supreme Court has been really, really fiercely protective of the right of free expression. They talk about the college campus as being uniquely the marketplace for ideas, meaning that at a college campus, you're supposed to have the freedom to experiment and try out even pretty extreme, maybe even a little wild, maybe a little crazy ideas, because sometimes every once in a while, those become accepted ideas over time. Sometimes something that seems a little wild and seems a little out there catches hold in the marketplace and gains a following and gains an audience. And the only way for it to do that is for people to be able to hear the message, right? And so the Supreme Court has been really super protective of the right to speak freely when you're at a public university. They've been less willing to protect the rights of minors, especially when they're speaking in the school setting. Where the kind of wellspring of all of the law of the First Amendment in schools begins is in a Supreme Court case in 1969 called the Tinker case. And this is the case that we all learn about in middle school or junior high school about the anti-war protesters who wore black armbands to school and were suspended for refusing to take them off. The U.S. Supreme Court comes back in 1969 and actually sides with the students students against the school and says that their First Amendment rights were violated when they were suspended. And this very memorable language that the Supreme Court gives us from the Tinker case is that students don't check their rights at the schoolhouse door. They're citizens, they're persons under our Constitution, and they can't just sort of recipients of whatever ideas the government wants to program into their heads. They have their own ideas, and they get to express them even on school grounds and during school time. So that was a wonderful case back in '69, but ever since that time, the Supreme Court has been nibbling away and retrenching a little bit, at least in the K through 12 setting. The landmark case that involved high school journalism is a case called the Hazelwood case in 1988. We just last year marked the 25th anniversary of that case, and that was really a terrible setback for the ability of students to freely express themselves in student publications, but it only applies to a student publication that is a part of the school curriculum. And so if a student wants to go set up a blog or a website off campus using their own time and their own money, they're not subject to the level of control recognized in Hazelwood. But in the Hazelwood case, the Supreme Court did recognize that students have less freedom than they would under the Tinker rule if what they're using to speak is not, as in Tinker, right, your own arm. Your own arm belongs to you, that's your own property. But if you're using the school's property, if you're using a school newspaper, yearbook, maybe a play, a graduation speech, a concert, something that's part of the school curriculum, you're going to have much less freedom to express yourself, and the school is going to have more latitude to censor, basically as long as the school can point to any reasonable justification, then the school is going to win and the student is going to lose. Well, Hazelwood took place in a Missouri high school, and that was back in 1988, and we never really knew if the Supreme Court was going to extend that to colleges or not, and they haven't directly been asked that, and they have not extended it to college. But unfortunately, across the country, there have been some lower courts that have extended it to college and have said, well, the Hazelwood case is about students, and college students are students, and if they're using a communication vehicle that is paid for by the school as part of the school curriculum, then they too might only have the very limited, minimal amount of protection that the Supreme Court recognized for children. So the state of the law at college is really a little bit muddled right now. It's a little bit confused, which is why we are encouraging students of all ages, but especially college students, to get out there and take ownership of their own rights by working with their own state legislatures to pass really good state laws like you have in Iowa. Iowa was one of the very first states after the Hazelwood ruling in 1988 to come back by state legislation and to reject the Hazelwood standard. And so in Iowa today, Hazelwood's really a non-entity. It's a non-factor because your state legislature has said, we don't believe that that's an adequate amount of free expression, and they reverted by state statute back to the Tinker level of school involvement, which to us is a perfectly sensible, balanced level that, you know, the school can step in at some really extreme moment if the students are getting ready to publish, you know, something illegal or physically dangerous to the school, but otherwise, if it's just controversial or sensitive, then, you know, we all gotta just develop a thick skin and learn to live with that, and, you know, be open-minded and welcome that perspective.
Right. Frank, in regards to the Hazelwood ruling, has there been any cases that you found that went against that ruling?
So yeah, since 1988, honestly, there really have been very few cases, and especially few in the journalism setting, that have gone all the way through the courts. And part of that is because the Hazelwood ruling was such a chill to students. It was such an extreme ruling that I think a lot of students, a lot of teachers, and a lot of lawyers really felt discouraged about taking on schools after that. They really looked at Hazelwood and said, well, you know, if the school's got any legitimate or reasonable basis whatsoever, they're going to win and we're going to lose. And, you know, it's always hard to get a journalism case into court anyway. If you just think about, you know, your common sense is going to tell you that federal courts do not work on newsroom deadlines, right? Federal courts work on a calendar that consists of years and not hours. And so there's really no way for a student who got illegally censored, even very blatantly illegally censored, to get all the way through, a U.S. District Court and then maybe a federal court of appeals in time for it to mean anything on a newspaper deadline, right? And so oftentimes you're left with just kind of looking for a moral victory, and not a lot of people are willing to spend 2.5 years of their lives for a moral victory, and so those cases don't go to court very, very much. There have been, in the high school setting, there was a young woman in Michigan named Kitty Dean who did take on her high school for censoring her story in a student newspaper, and won a really decisive ruling from a United States District Court, which said, well, even after Hazelwood, even after the Supreme Court gave the school the authority to censor for any legitimate basis, it really does have to be a legitimate basis and not just withholding truthful information from the public because it might be embarrassing or it might reflect negatively on the image of the school. And that's what the school was doing in the Utica School District. What they were just trying to suppress a story that called the public's attention to the fact that there was a lawsuit that had been filed against the school, and they found that embarrassing. They thought it was too negative. They didn't want students talking about it, and so they forced her to pull the story. And even after Hazelwood, a district court ruled in her favor and told her she had the right to publish. So it is still possible to fight City Hall. It's just a little harder than it was. And then in the college setting, in 2001, a student down at the Kentucky State University took her school to court and won, even after for censorship of a college yearbook. And the school came back in that situation and said, well, we're not sure whether Hazelwood applies at the college level or not, but even let's assume that it does apply, the school still doesn't get to overstep what the editors want to do when it comes just to matters of sort of subjective taste and style decisions. In that case, the decision, the argument was really about just matters of basic editorial judgment. What color should the yearbook cover be? Should we put pictures of national political events in the yearbook or not? So there were really, nothing disruptive to the school, nothing that tread the lines of the law. Just things that the school disagreed with the subjective taste decisions made by the editors, and the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals came back and ruled in favor of the editors and against Kentucky State and said, no, those decisions legally belong to the students even after Hazelwood. So it's definitely possible to win a legal challenge, but I'm not going to lie, it's gotten quite a bit harder, and that's why these state laws, what are called anti-Hazelwood laws, can be so valuable.
Right. So you do believe that there is a hope for overturning the ruling at any point? The Hazelwood ruling?
I have to say, I don't think that it's very likely that we're going to get in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and they're suddenly going to change their mind about Hazelwood. It's really, really hard to dislodge a legal precedent at the Supreme Court. And what you would have to show, I think, realistically, is you'd have to show that life has changed so much since the 1980s, that society has just changed and is so different that the assumptions that were made back in the 1980s don't apply anymore. And I think we may get there. But honestly, what I think is probably more likely to happen is that censorship is just going to be put out of business by technology. I think, and that's one of the amazing things that we've seen. If you look around the world at all of the democracy breaking out all over the world that's been enabled by social networking and texting and the wonders of modern communications technology. And when tyrannical governments want to shut down rebellions and want to crush out democracy, the first thing they do is try to pull the plug on social networking sites, right? Because they realize this is how people organize today. Well, I think that, as student audiences get comfortable getting their news from online platforms and they're no longer tethered to that school-produced, school-funded print newspaper, which is probably only a generation away, realistically, then censorship is just going to sort of go out of business, right? I mean, if the school isn't paying, if there's no printing budget, if the students are publishing on their own time, using their own resources to create the medium, then I'm not really sure. Well, I mean, Hazelwood certainly wouldn't apply at that point because you're not using government property anymore. Now you're using your your own personal property to communicate. So I think, in time, I mean, not to say that, censorship now is certainly, seems like some sort of quaint, antiquated relic that schools are still trying to protect these little baby children's delicate ears, even though everybody's now got HBO and can see nudity and swearing 24 hours a day. This idea that somehow we have to still protect these little baby children's ears it seems really antiquated, but it's still there. But I really think that technology eventually is going to just put it out of business.
I think the same way, actually. Because of the Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer case, and even Hosty versus Carter, the Supreme Court has seemed to move in the direction of limiting student press even more. Can you maybe offer some insights into what the implications for these rulings have been for student press as a whole?
Yeah, so, and you mentioned Hosty versus Carter. So, right, Hosty versus Carter was kind of a version of a Hazelwood case at the college level. What you had in the Hosty case, this was a case out of Governor State University in Illinois, and it was a censorship case at the college level where students were trying to publish material that was unflattering to the school, and the school kind of seized control of the newspaper and said, you're not going to distribute it with this material that we disagree with. And a federal appeals court in Illinois, unfortunately, did come back and say, well, look, the Supreme Court said in Hazelwood that when you're dealing with students in schools, the school has a right to govern the paper in any reasonable manner, and we think this is a school and these are students, and so the Hazelwood standard applies even at the college level. Fortunately, that's just one region that includes just 3 states in the Midwest. And fortunately, as soon as that ruling came down, the state of Illinois passed a version of your Iowa Student Press Rights Act in Illinois. And so they overturned the impact of Hosty anyway in Illinois. But it's still out there, and it's still discouraging, and it's still troubling. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear, right? It's very clear that what happens when you have the Hazelwood level of control over student media is that it is an intimidating presence that hangs over the shoulder of the student editor, even if the censorship authority isn't explicitly used. Just knowing that it's there, knowing that the principal could pull the funding for the paper or refuse to distribute it at any minute, causes students to censor themselves. It causes them to steer clear of controversial or sensitive topics and to keep their journalism kind of dumbed down and dulled down. And that's the last thing we want. We should want people to be engaging on sensitive issues of public concern, because all the studies show that that's the only effective way to learn civics. The only effective way to learn civics is to discuss current events. That's the only proven method that actually moves the needle at all in terms of civic engagement and civic education. And yet, the single most effective tool that we have to do that, the single most effective tool for introducing the debate of current and contemporary events into the school, the student newspaper, is being told in a lot of schools that that's off limits, that we don't talk about contemporary, current, controversial events. We're dealing with a situation right now down in Florida where a high school student in the Tampa area just wanted to write a story about the possibility that marijuana might be legalized for medicinal purposes. And she's told by her own advisor at the paper, no, you don't understand. The purpose of this paper is to promote a positive image of the school and to be a mouthpiece for school functions and school events. And so any discussion of a political issue like that is out of place in the pages of the newspaper. And I think the response to that is, well, if political issues don't belong in a newspaper, where do they belong? When are students going to have that discussion? When are they going to learn to engage on the issues that they're about eligible to vote on, right? I mean, some students, even at the high school level, are 18-year-old registered voters. And the idea that you have a right to vote and you have a right to participate in politics, maybe even be old enough to run for office, and yet you don't have a right to talk about it, seems really hard to reconcile, right? And so, yeah, I think, unfortunately, what we have seen is that in the schools that apply a heavy hand of Hazelwood control, that it does bleach the newspapers of any controversy, and it intimidates the students, frankly, into bringing to light problems in the school. That's one of the really important functions that student media can be performing in today's society, because we don't have a whole lot of full-time professional education journalists out there anymore. You go to a K-12 school these days. In fact, I was just visiting one about 2 weeks ago, and I asked, well, when do you see journalists from your local newspaper or your local TV station at the school? And the answer was, only when there's a violent crime. That's when we get news coverage. If somebody gets shot, that's when they show up. Other than that, there's no coverage of the affairs of the school anymore. And that's because, the staffing and professional has really shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. Well, somebody's got to take up that slack. Somebody's got to tell us if school is, ineffective, if it's dangerous, if it's dirty, if the computers don't work, if the books are outdated. Somebody's got to tell the public that story. And if student journalists don't tell us, I'm not sure anybody else can anymore.
Right. So, in regards to that, where do you see examples of student press organizations serving as watchdogs in place of pushback from the authorities?
Well, fortunately, right, we have a number of states. There are 7 states around the country, including Iowa, that have got these really excellent anti-Hazelwood laws. And in those states in particular, places like California, you've got some really, really professional caliber watchdog journalism going on. We worked with some students up in Palo Alto, California, who were doing a story about date rape. And about the consequences of date rape and how it happens. Their point was their school is this very affluent, high-achieving school full of, students who are kids of Stanford professors, and they're all, college-bound kids, and yet the story students wanted to get across is that date rape doesn't just happen to bad kids in bad schools, it happens everywhere.
Right.
It's a really powerful story that these students were uniquely able to tell because of their access to their classmates. And it was quite controversial at the time to publish it, but it was very widely acclaimed when they did it. And there are a number of cases like that where students are sort of using that unique perspective and access that they have to bring the public stories that are really important for all of us, not just students, adults, voters, taxpayers, to know. Another one that comes to mind that we're working on right now, there's a high school in New Jersey where a student who is doing exactly what we should want student journalists to do, covering her local school board, going to the meetings and putting in that shoe leather journalistic reporting work that we want people to do. She wants to write a story about the fact that there are multiple employee grievances that had been filed against her school superintendent, which, you would think the public needs to know this, right? Especially since the school superintendent was up for a contract renewal at the time of these grievances. And so that should be something taken into account as to whether he keeps his job or not. And she's told by her school, well, no, we don't allow students to discuss personnel issues in student newspapers. That's just inappropriate for student journalism. Well, if that's the news outlet on which people within the school community are most reliant, and they're not going to be able to tell the story, then the people in the school community, they don't go and sit through school board meetings. Students are the eyes and ears of that school community, and they need to be able to tell stories like that.
No, most definitely. So maybe to get even more specific about, what student press is and isn't allowed to report on, what about an instance about a member of student press who's taking camera footage or something at a crime scene on campus, and it involves another student being hurt? Can police officers or EMT people confiscate their camera, which undermines in the sense that they might be undermining the ongoing investigation?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is unfortunately a conflict that we see very frequently around the country, and by the way, is in no way limited to students. Professional journalists encounter this as well when they show up at the scene of a disaster or a crime or some unrest of some sort. That interaction between photojournalists and videographers and police can get really tense. And there's a very short and simple legal answer to that question, which is that it is never, ever, 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 under any circumstances, legal for a police officer to confiscate or destroy a camera or anything in it. That is called stealing. It is theft. It is a crime. And a police officer who does that should himself lose his badge and go to jail. It is legal. It is legalized theft. You would have no more right as a police officer to punish somebody for taking photos where you don't like them taken by deleting the photos than you would to reach into their pocket, take out their wallet, and start tearing up money in their wallet, right? Because those photos are money. Those photos are worth are valuable property. And by the way, very often they might belong to the publication and not to the individual anyway. And so the answer is, if you, in the rare instance that a photo is actually breaking the law, right? Let's say you go running up onto somebody's front porch, which is trespassing, where you're not invited, and you start taking photos of the, inside of their home when you were not invited to do so. The remedy for that is that the police write you a citation for trespassing. You get a ticket, you pay a fine, maybe you go to court and you fight it. The remedy is not that they get to steal your stuff. This is not in the law, and the police don't, letting a police officer take your camera or take your memory card out of it that's like letting them be the judge, jury, and executioner, that they get to not only make the accusation but also carry out the sentence, right? And that's not the way the law works. So yeah, the answer is, it is never, ever, ever legal for the police to take or destroy footage. And also, there's not any law against a journalist photographing or videotaping an emergency situation or a crime scene. If something is viewable by a passerby, by a pedestrian, a person riding by on the bike, a person walking their dog, then that's a public event at that point, and the police don't get to just private and say, we prefer not to be photographed. Luckily, there have been actually 2 federal court of appeals opinions in the last 3 years, where we have now one out of Boston and one out of the right to take footage of police doing police business in public places, and that includes audio recording their voices as they're doing their business. And so it really should be beyond dispute right now, and police should be better trained that journalists get to do that, even if the police would prefer not to be watched.
Mm-hmm. That's really good to know.
Yeah. So we kind of touched on earlier, Freedom of Information Act, which Iowa has their own, and sunshine laws that require government agencies, including public schools, to make available to the public that official records of meetings, and where the school gets its funding and how it chooses to spend it. And then there's also the Clery Act, which requires that crime statistics in regards to the number and type of incidences of crime that occurred on every college campus also must be made public. So why are these laws so important, and especially when it comes to student press and the access that student press has to information?
Right. Well, one thing we should point out, because there are 2 different standards for public colleges and private colleges, right? At a public university or a public college, a state institution, you're part of the state government, and so you are subject to all the same open government laws at a state college or state university as the state Department of Transportation is, or any other state government agency is. At a private university, really, the state disclosure laws rarely come into play at all, and there's not very much at all that you can demand that your institution disclose under state law. But fortunately, and you mentioned one of them, the Clery Act, there are a number of federal disclosure laws that do entitle people to get information, even from a private college. And Clery is an especially important one because it involves public safety. The Congress enacted the Clery Act specifically because there was a perceived problem with colleges not with people about dangerous crimes on their campuses. So the intent anyway, and it's debatable whether this is necessarily effective in doing its job or not, but the intent was to give people both timely warning when there was a dangerous crime unfolding on their campus, and also to give people accurate statistical information so that they could kind of make an assessment for themselves about whether the campus was safe, whether their trend was going in the right direction or the wrong direction, whether there are particular crimes that maybe weren't being taken seriously enough that the campus needed to do a better job with. And so, yeah, the federal disclosure laws can be a real godsend for people at private colleges. There are federal disclosure laws that require the income tax returns of a private university to be disclosed and made public record, that require the athletic budget and the salaries for the coaching staff to be made public, and a number of other laws sort of sprinkled throughout the federal code that do give at least some glimpse inside the workings of a private university. You ask, well, why are these important? I mean, they're important because you as a journalist, or even just as a concerned citizen, you can't force somebody to sit down and cooperate with you, right? If you're, you're trying to write a story about a college, you can't force the president or the vice president or the provost to sit down and give you an interview or spend time with you or disclose anything in particular to you. But what you can force them to do is show you their records. And so if you have an institution that is particularly secretive and uncooperative, as unfortunately a lot of them are, that law kind of serves as an equalizer. They can't completely shut you out. They can't completely throw a blanket of secrecy over what they're doing, because the law does require disclosure of, anything and everything in a public institution that contains information. So, that includes video recordings, audio recordings, transcripts, anything that includes that memorializes information can be a public record. So, yeah, it's a very powerful watchdog tool that enables journalists in particular to just shed light on what these institutions are doing. Because after all, education in this country is one of the largest dollar business undertakings we have. It is in the trillions of dollars in terms of what schools and colleges spend on a yearly basis, and that's our money for the most part, and we ought to know where it's going.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, in your opinion, what do student press members need to know in order to make appropriate requests for information and receive timely response by the authorities?
Well, great. So, one thing that I think is always important as a starting point to understand is that the state disclosure laws are the minimum that you can get and not the maximum, right? Mm-hmm. That is the floor and not the ceiling on what a government agency can give you. I mentioned getting a face-to-face or an in-person interview, right? Well, no law requires a government agency to do that. No law requires the provost to make herself available for any particular amount of time, but many people will do that voluntarily just as a matter of good governance and, sort of public responsibility. And so people will often ask us, well, can I get this or can I get that? Can I get this piece of information? Can I get that piece? And my response is always the same. You will never know until you try, because sometimes people do give you more than the absolute bare minimum than the law requires, and it is always worth giving that a try. But if you do find yourself with a school that is sort of determined to only give you the bare minimum, I always say that sort of persistence and good haggling skills pay off. The same skills that will pay off if you're buying a car or if you're otherwise engaged in some other consumer transaction. You have to look at public records like a consumer transaction, and that sometimes means don't take the sticker price. We're working with a student right now in Georgia who actually has a court case going against the university system down there, which tried to grossly overcharge him for public records. They quoted a fee to him initially that was in the neighborhood of $4,000 for records that wound up costing only $200 or so when he finally haggled them down. And so a lot of times you'll get a denial or you'll get some jackpot price quote that's completely out of proportion to reality. And a lot of people, unfortunately, will get discouraged at that and walk away, and you ought not to. It is often the case that no can be turned into a yes, or at least a partial yes. And so that's where the great reporters separate themselves from just the okay ones. As the people who figure out how to get past that initial no.
Yeah, right. So jumping back to the Clery Act, why does the Clery Act only apply to colleges and universities and not high school students?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that. The history of it is that it goes back to the 1980s. There was a horrific crime on the campus at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, where a young woman was murdered in the residence halls on the campus, and it was the parents felt that if the student had been warned that the campus was a dangerous place, that she might have taken better precautions to protect her own safety, and perhaps the crime might have been avoided. And so, as a result of that, that was the Cleary family. That's for whom the act is named. The Cleary Act was enacted specifically to respond to this perceived inadequacy of warnings and inadequacy of notice on college campuses. I think, as a practical matter, it's just so much harder to conceal a serious crime on the campus of a high school than of a college, right? I mean, just sort of think about the geography of a college, and it'd be entirely possible for somebody to be victimized by a crime in some remote building on the opposite side of the campus from where you are right now, and you'd never hear a thing, you'd never see a thing, and maybe never know that it happened. In a high school, right? If you had somebody, God forbid, victimized like Jean Cleary was in the middle of a high school, everyone would know instantly, and so I just think that the non-disclosure risk was considered to be so much greater at the college level. And frankly, where we usually see crimes happening is where people are spending their nights and weekends, right? I mean, if you're going to have sexual assaults, you're going to have aggravated assaults, you're probably going to have them where people are spending their nights and their weekends because, frankly, they're there around the clock. There's just more opportunities for trouble. And so that's probably not going to be high school. That's probably going to be college.
That's a good point. Something that I would love to talk about are shield laws, and especially in regards to student press. Are there shield laws that exist, and to what extent do they protect journalists, especially those who are compelled to protect the journalists themselves, protect an anonymous source?
Right. These are one of the most important tools of the law that journalists need to know about. And fortunately, most people will go their entire career never having to rely on it. But it's sort of like that life raft in the airplane. You want to locate it and know that it's there. You better be sure it's going to work every time, because you don't want to find out it doesn't work when you're in the water. And the shield law is sort of like that. A lot of times people refer to this as the reporter's privilege, but I think that's sort of inaccurate. It's really the source's privilege. At the end of the day, the person who is really being protected is the whistleblower, the person who is going to a journalist and says, hey, you need to protect me because I might lose my job, I might get fired, I might get sued, you need to keep my identity confidential, but I have information that's important for me to share, and I want to talk to you off the record. The reporter's privilege is what enables a journalist when they're confronted by the police or they're served with a subpoena from a lawyer. No, I will not cooperate with this, even though as an average ordinary citizen, I would have to. As an average ordinary citizen, if you get subpoenaed to come testify at a trial, you're supposed to sit there in that stand and testify truthfully and bring all your documents with you. And as a journalist, if what is being requested is the work product that you worked on as a journalist, then you can say no. You get to say no. There are a handful of these privileges that the law recognizes where our legislatures have decided that there is some overriding kind of public interest in not having you testify, that's even more important than your truthful testimony. For example, the attorney-client privilege, right? I can't go to your lawyer and make your lawyer spill his guts about anything that you have confided in that lawyer in confidence, because we want people to confide in their lawyers, right? And if we knew that my lawyer could turn right around and rat me out to a judge, then people wouldn't confide anymore. And so in order to protect that relationship, these privileges were created, and the journalist privilege works the same way, that we want to protect that reporter-source relationship, because and we think it's good for people to be able to safely blow the whistle on wrongdoing. Well, you asked about students, so again, fortunately, this doesn't come up all that terribly much, but there have been a handful of cases. We dealt with one recently up in Northern California, a school called Saratoga High School, where students did receive a subpoena from a law firm demanding the identity of anonymous sources that they had used in a story, which had sort of tangentially become a topic of a lawsuit. And the lawyers felt that the knowledge of these anonymous sources might advance their lawsuit. They wanted the journalists to come forward and disclose them. And the journalists, with the help of one of our volunteer lawyers, were able to successfully resist and get that subpoena withdrawn. California reporter's privilege. There are two types of privilege laws around the country, and California's is typical of the ones around the country that protect people who are engaged in journalism, basically. If you're gathering and sharing news, then you're a reporter. There are a handful of states, unfortunately, Texas is one, Florida is one, some of the big states that have statutes on the books saying, no, only professional people who are making a substantial financial living off of their journalism are journalistic enough to be protected by the privilege. And we think that that's very short-sighted, especially now when so much journalism is being done, and really high-quality journalism a lot of times, by people who are kind of volunteers, right? People who are working in a laboratory setting at a college campus, or working on a student newspaper where they're not salaried. That at times is every bit as good as the journalism being put forward by professionals for pay. And if it's journalism that is that serious and that meritorious, then it deserves equal recognition under the law.
So, kind of as a challenge to you, and this was brought up in our legal and ethical perspectives class, if you had to eliminate one of the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment, which one would you eliminate and why?
Oh my gosh, this is like, which limb would you cut off?
I know it. It's Andrea's fault.
That's painful. This is going to sound really strange coming from somebody whose organization has press in the name, right? A Press Law Center, but I would have to say the Press Freedom Clause is probably the one that over time has proven to be the least essential and the least necessary, only because the courts have sort of equated the right of freedom of speech and the right of freedom of the press, and there's not very much, if anything, that would not fully be covered by the speech clause that is covered by the press clause. And there's some kind of academic debate about whether there might be some heightened right under the press clause that does not exist under the speech clause, but I think for all intents and practical purposes, they are really equivalent. And so, even though it is wonderful that the press has this kind of exalted status that it's actually mentioned by name in the Constitution, and that's wonderful, I'm not sure it's necessary.
So then, if that was to be eliminated, what would be serving as kind of the watchdog in regards to, what the press... I mean, the press's job is to serve as the watchdog of our government. Without the freedom of press, I mean, who would be the watchdog?
I think as a practical matter, what would wind up happening is, and we've already seen this happen in cases from time to time, that the courts would wind up protecting what we think about as journalism anyway under the speech clause, because the speech clause really says, right, Congress shall make no law, blah, 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 restricting the free exercise of speech. And so, journalism is speech, right? So I think really what we would wind up seeing is that the courts would fashion a press-like level of protection out of the speech clause, and a lot of them have are already. So, not to say that that's not a valuable thing, and again, it's symbolically a really valuable thing. It's symbolically really valuable to have the press recognized as being so essential to democracy that it had to be enumerated specifically in the Bill of Rights. But I think, like I said, I think what would happen is we would see the courts protect journalism anyway. But fortunately, that's never going to happen.
So, a question that I have is, what right do you deem as the most important?
Wow. Well, I mean, I think you have to say, right, that the freedom of speech is the one that makes all the other ones possible, right? I mean, the freedom of speech really is so foundational that without that, the right to petition or the right to assemble really would be sort of Right, well, we can assemble and we can make all the plans we want to, but we don't have the right to actually convey our sentiments to the government or share them publicly or publish them because the government could always squelch us out, right? So I think you would have to say that the freedom of speech is sort of, the backbone, the spine that supports all the other ones.
All right, so for students that aren't involved with student press, why should they care about the freedom of press at all?
Well, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution a lot of times are like a parachute in an airplane where you really don't think about it at all until you need it. But when you need it, you really need it. And there's no other substitute for it. And it's got to work every single time. And so, yeah, we don't go around, it is, or maybe the better analogy is it's a little bit like the oxygen in the air that we breathe, right? I mean, you don't walk around sort of consciously appreciating, I'm so thankful for oxygen, right? It's an afterthought. It's just assumed that, of course, there will always be oxygen there for me, and we just take that for granted. And our constitutional rights in a lot of ways are like that as well. We sort of take that for granted that, well, of course, nobody could put me in jail for what I say. Of course, nobody could throw me out of school just for holding a minority viewpoint or a controversial political position. But from time to time, we do see overreaching by schools and colleges where they do try to punish people for unpopular views. And that is when the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment just become indispensable, and so, I mean, I think that's the answer. The answer is, as a student or just as an American citizen, right? You should thank your lucky stars that the reason that the government isn't, knocking on your door and kicking it in so that they can just forage around and search for evidence of crimes with no reasonable suspicion, or grabbing the hard drive out of your computer and taking it back to the police station just so they can flip around and see if they find anything interesting, right? The reason they don't do all that is because of the Bill of Rights, so it's sort of it exists as a check on a government overreaching effective that most of the time we're not even conscious that it's there.
So what are some recent cases that you have encountered that, involve the matter in which you just spoke of? In the sense that they can't be outside entities can't be overstepping their bounds, and, press having access to information and the ability to have the freedom to say what they would like to say through press.
Well, there was a kind of an interesting situation that we dealt with back in the start of this school year at a high school in California, Bear Creek High School, that I think sort of exemplifies the way that the First Amendment is playing out in the social media era, in the Web 2.0 era. And what happened there is really typical of what's going on at a lot of schools and even colleges today, where the school was trying to step into the off-campus social media lives of its students in a very big way. And this school decided that they were going to impose this contract on students where if you wanted to do anything at all extracurricular, play sports or play an instrument in the band, anything, you're going to have to essentially sign away all your First Amendment rights. You're going to have to sign this contract which says, I agree as a condition to being able to participate in extracurriculars that I can be punished for anything and everything that I say on social media if somebody deems it to be inappropriate. And that was the word that they used, was inappropriate. And so if some employee of the school decided that you said or did anything on social media, and this could be on summer vacation too, this could be in the middle of July when you're at home using your own home internet service and your own home computer, if somebody just took a disliking to what you said on social media, out you go. You're off the team, you're off the staff of the newspaper, you're out of the band. And this seemed wildly overreactive to the problem that they claimed to be trying to address, which was online bullying, right? I mean, there's a vast difference between attack speech that is aimed at a particular individual versus inappropriate speech, right? I mean, inappropriate speech could be just espousing a really extreme political position or a really weird religious belief, right? It could be anything. It could be criticizing the getting from the school, which is the kind of speech we worry about the most and want the most to protect. Well, so we were able to get a really good volunteer lawyer to go to bat for the students and to explain to the school, look, here are all the ways that this is not constitutional under the First Amendment and also not consistent with your own excellent state laws in California. And luckily, the school district backed off. The school district backed off and rescinded the policy in the face, not just of our opposition, but the students and their parents' opposition as well, saying this is just too much intrusion into people's off-campus lives. They get to be citizens again when they leave your school. The Supreme Court said in 1969 that students don't leave their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. Well, the implication was that when you leave the schoolhouse gate, you get your rights back, right? You leave the schoolhouse gate, you're a full-blown citizen again, and we think that really means something. So, I think that's where kind of the First Amendment battles of contemporary 2014 are being fought. They're being fought on social media right now because the difference between media and social media is shrinking all the time. People are breaking. So we have to protect the freedom to express yourself on social media if we're serious about protecting the freedom of journalism.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, there isn't, in my opinion, really a way for the schools to kind of hinder somebody's right or what they put on student media. What have you experienced any major ways in which someone has tried to do that besides this case? I mean, because you're doing it within the privacy of your own home, so it's hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that a school would even attempt to try to take away someone's First Amendment right outside of the school. So, have you experienced that beyond, this, or beyond the California case?
Yeah, no, you'd be really surprised. In fact, we always encourage people, even at the college level, to check out their own student code of conduct and that student handbook and see if it extends the authority of the college into your off-campus speech, because a surprising number of them do. We were involved in a case that unfortunately came out on the losing side of years ago against a large public university, the University of Minnesota. Some people who should know better, right? Who went after their student for something that she posted on Facebook. And it was just harmless humor. It was, some of it was a little edgy, but it was just harmless humor. And she was the subject of one of her fellow students complained to a teacher about something that she read on the student's Facebook page. It was investigated, and it was determined that the student didn't mean any harm, that she was just joking around, but the school deemed what she posted on Facebook to be, that old word again, inappropriate, to be unprofessional, to be not befitting of the profession that she was studying to enter, which in her case, she was studying mortuary science. She wanted to be a funeral director. Oh, wow. And her professors decided that her speech on Facebook was unprofessional and not befitting of somebody who wanted to occupy that profession. And so they disciplined her. They punished her for the speech on her own time on her personal Facebook page that was done using her home computer service. And unfortunately, this went all the way through the Minnesota Supreme Court, which said the school gets to do this, that this is sort of an exemption. If your school decides that what you put online reflects a violation of the standards of your profession, that's no longer First Amendment protected speech. I'm not unsympathetic to schools that want to enforce good professional behavior, but there are ways to do that short of the disciplinary system, right? We're there to be educated, and education is always the first and best resort. If a professor takes you aside and says, "Hey, look, Claire, that what you posted on Facebook is really unprofessional, and it reflects badly on your reputation, and it's going to hinder you in your career," you're going to pull it down. You're going to fix it of your own volition, out of your own self-interest, for your own career advancement. And nobody needs to bring down the hammer of disciplinary authority on you. That we've sort of given up on this idea that the education system is there to educate you, and we think that punishing is teaching. It's almost like something out of an Orwell book, right? That in order to educate you, we have to kick you out of school. Well, wait a second. Meeting is taking place when you're kicked out of school, and so yeah, I think we're going to unfortunately, I think, look back on this current generation and kind of shake our heads and go, I can't believe we're so freaked out and panicked over harmless, innocent nonsense on social media. Schools and colleges are just way too image conscious over little stray remarks that people post on social media that we all ought to just learn to let roll off our backs.
Well, it looks like we're about out of time. Really quick, for our benefit and yours, or for our viewers' benefit, what would be some resources that you would recommend?
Well, certainly, the SPLC website's a great place to get started on researching your rights. That's www.splc.org. We've also started a site called curehazelwood.org. Curehazelwood.org is sort of a mini site that we set up that encourages people to report outbreaks of hazelwood, outbreaks of censorship, because we do think that hazelwood is cancerous to good education, and it's treated as a disease that it is, and it should be eradicated. And so those are our websites, but beyond really excellent ones out there. Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press is a wonderful resource that has lots and lots of information about open government laws. There are, and I always encourage people to follow what is going on in their own state legislatures, especially, and I just can't emphasize that enough. That's along with education coverage, one of the other things that has really diminished is news coverage of state legislatures. And so follow your own state legislature, track those bills, keep an eye on them as a good citizen, because your rights are being affected each and every day, sometimes without you knowing and without very many people watching out for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for joining us for our First Amendment Week special. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and happy First Amendment Week.
Thank you.
And thank you, viewers, for tuning in to Stop the Presses.
And remember that without the First Amendment, our country would fall into a dictatorship.
Thanks again.
Bye.